So people have asked me for my take on the Scholar. What's going on with it? Is it good? Is it bad? I've talked so much about the Sage, many people even think that I'm quitting the Scholar, which I was never fully convinced that I'd actually quit it. I mean, it's been 7 years, or yeah, it's been over 7 years now, 2013 for Realm Reborn, my god. But with the full toolkit reveal, I can confidently tell you for an absolute fact that there is no way that I'm quitting it. In spite of a few flaws, and they definitely are there, the Scholar is extremely, and I mean extremely powerful. Now that we know the Endwalker toolkit, I'd say doubly so going into Endwalker. In fact, and I know unfortunately this will rattle some people, but I do feel obligated to be as honest as I can, especially on my own YouTube channel. I'm fully convinced at this point that the Scholar will be the #1 go-to healer for progression for many raid groups that are going to be demanding it explicitly for progression reasons. I mean, I go through the pros and cons because that's how I'm going to structure this video. I think that a lot of people are going to really understand why I say that. Starting out this video are going to be the pros of the Scholar. The first pro is going to be that the fairy background healing is undeniably strong and takes off a metric ton of pressure from both the Scholar and their co-healer, and this is actually going to be a game changer. It requires no effort from you to swap targets, it is flexible, especially when you get comfortable with the idea of placing in particular locations, and can allow you to get away with healing the party in AoE even if mechanics force you personally into different spots like a southeast corner as the party's in the northwest corner. It's, to be frank, just a nauseatingly consistent effect. You actively need to try and sabotage it in order to get it to stop. Side of effects like dissipation, of course, guys. At that point, you're making the decision to do that trade-off. Second big pro is that the Scholar also has very consistent damage output. During a progression raid, sometimes mechanics are handled poorly, and this requires you to do wide sweeping movements, and Ruin 2 is better than no damage contribution and is really unique among the healers. Ast and White Mage don't really have anything even remotely the same. Sage's Toxicon is the closest to being similar, but that requires Serpent Sting charges to actually execute, meaning that that's going to be constrained, and the Scholar really has no such worry. They only sacrifice 75 potency. While that might sound a lot, isn't that a lot lower of a number than 295? Well, this really enables the Scholar to be able to make up and actually recuperate some of the damage loss when mechanics are handled poorly. The third pro is that Scholar has a rotation that is very hard, to be quite honest, to mess up. Outside of placing Chain Stratagem at the wrong time outside of the raid buff window, the Scholar has fewer keys to mess up than most healers. An Ass can place a card on the wrong person, the White Mage might not use Afflatus Misery or Ass Ice in the raid buff window, the Sage might use Phlegma outside of the raid buff window as soon as they get it off of the 45-second cooldown. In a very hilarious way, the Scholar in a high intensity raid environment is likely to suffer the absolute least from potential mess ups and really just be consistent in their throughput. Broil spam is boring, very boring, but effective. Now the fourth pro is that Expedient is an obscenely powerful ability. Movement speed that lasts 20 seconds is very, very powerful and bizarre. This ability allows the Scholar to give the party, in conjunction with Sprint at a different cooldown, you can use them separately, 1/3 of an entire fight with accelerated movement speed, which is bizarre. So take a 10-minute fight, and just under 4 minutes of that fight can be party zipping around choosing mechanics and handling them easier. And as anyone who has done raiding knows, positioning, movement, mobility, that is really how you resolve a lot of the mechanics, and so enhancing positioning, movement, and that to resolve the mechanics makes the fights a little bit more, how to say it, the movement speed will not be mandatory, but it will definitely take the edge off. Anyone who's done something like Lions knows, okay, we need to go, at least my position in my static was, okay, I need to go to the far north in Lion, I bait the first puddle. I need to run all the way to the right-hand side, I need to then wait that out, then I need to run all the way back north. If I didn't have Sprint, that made that a very, very much harder mechanic to have. Scholars Expedient? I would take that in a heartbeat. I don't think that I'm alone in that. I know I'm a broken record, but again, this is just consistency, and again, consistency. Just to make sure that I clarify so that I don't lose people on why I say 1/3 of the fight. Expedient, 2-minute cooldown timer, 20 seconds. Sprint, 60-second cooldown timer, 10-second duration. Expedient cut in half is 60-second cooldown, 10-second duration. And so you just stack those up, and then you get 60 divided by 2 is going to be roughly 1/3 of the time. But of course, remember that depending on lull times during a raid, this is actually going to be more useful than just 1/3 of the time, because a lot of the time you're just going to be stacked on the boss. But I am totally going on a tangent here, so I'm going to cut it back. Fifth pro is that Scholar has extremely large shields against spike damage. The Sage can do some bonker stuff too, but the Scholar with deployment Tactics and Dissipation and Fey Illumination, Seraph can consistently volley out extremely durable shields, and with Deployment Tactics buff to only a 90-second cooldown and that add low buff to convert 300 health potency at a rate of 180% means it's a baseline 540 potency shield that can be spread across the party. That's beefy. That's huge. Like, really big. So that makes it that the Scholar is the absolute king of big upfront barriers that will pad incoming damage with ease. Remember that the Scholar can also spread out these cooldowns too, so they can make up the gaps with pretty potent barriers. Dissipation with Protraction Deployment Tactics add low, valid combination. Succor with the Seraph barrier, still huge. Toss and Fey Illumination and the potential really for the Scholar to volley out shields is flat out bizarre. I'm not trying to put down Sage's Panheima effect because that's still going to be strong, but when we're talking about cutting down initial big spikes, like single spikes, the Scholar has it absolutely in the bag. It's outside of spamming the Eucrasian Prognosis effect with Panheima, which is available every 2 minutes, what can they really do to spread the shields? Not all that much, honestly, unfortunately. They have nothing even coming close to Deployment Tactics. Now this gets into the cons of this Scholar. So the first con is going to be Anti-Synergy, and largely, I want to be upfront, largely this is something alleviated as a con through proper cooldown and timing management and being aware of the cons beforehand. Like, these are big quality of life concerns, but I don't think that any experienced Scholar is going to look at Dissipation and be like, oh, what is this? It's a pretty button. Oh my god, I'm pressing the button. Oh my god, where did the fairy go? I'm so confused. What happened? I don't see it. You know what that button does when you're experienced with it. You know the trade-offs. And a lot of the time, they're absolutely worth it. You bet when the fairy has no cooldowns, I'm gonna do that. But I digress. So the first con is that Dissipation removes your background healing, your fairy's gone, and it locks you out of any fairy abilities. Huge anti-synergy, but the rewards are a huge 20% healing amplification for Adlo or Succor, making some gnarly combos like mentioned before, as well as 3 Aetherflow stacks. And you bet when the fairy has no cooldown, I will absolutely chomp them. I will shove them in my mouth, chomp that fairy, and get that 3 Aetherflow and place down a Sacred Soil. Second con is that you have no fairy control, and while the fact that the fairy auto targets is brilliant, outside of using Fey Union, the fairy might chip heal some damage on a DPS that really sucks, something that you can easily resolve through Whispering Dawn or the like. And I kind of also view it as when I'm tired from like a long day at work and log into the game, I'm questioning, like, will I have the energy to keep up with cardio weaving for 6 hours after work for a 6-hour long gaming session? In my mind, it's unlikely for longer than 4 hours, in which case EOS taking the reins can be a huge help. Third con is BROIL spam is boring. Like, yes, it's a pro because it is very hard to mess up and you're getting a lot of value from it. Very consistent. You will be very consistent. But outside of harder raid content, it is a slog. Low level dungeons is just Art of War spam over and over again. It's not interesting, it's powerful. It's very powerful. Like, I cannot emphasize that enough, guys. You will absolutely dumpster whatever content you're doing just by doing that, but it's hideously boring. The fourth con is that because the Scholar has the raid buff chain stratagem, it's very possible for your group to represent it poorly. Misaligned raid buff windows, them not using cooldowns or big abilities during it, it's very possible to make chain stratagem look really useless if you cherry pick data from FF logs. So now the fifth con is that the Scholar can very easily run out of gas if misplayed, easier than any other healer, including the Sage. And this is the situation where you've spent all of your cooldowns, you don't have any of them up at a given moment, and this includes obviously when you're out of Aetherflow, meaning no Aetherflow abilities are up. So that means there's no Recitation for Recitation Indom, no Aetherflow for basic Indom, no Sacred Soil, no Whispering Dawn. Whispering Dawn's on cooldown, Big Fairy Seraph is on cooldown. This is a state that is very possible on Scholar, and it genuinely sucks. I say the Scholar has this worse than even the Sage because the Sage gets their Aetherflow equivalent called Serpent Skull every 20 seconds, whereas the Scholar, you can in theory blow all 3 Aetherflow stacks at the start of when you get Aetherflow up, and now you have 50 seconds of no Aetherflow, which as you can well imagine sucks because the equivalent is that the Sage gets their next Aetherflow equivalent, their Serpent Skull, at 20-second intervals and will never be in a 50 or 55 second wait time for it. The Scholar, however, is put in that. And I mean, yes, ultimately when all the numbers are said and done, the Scholar gets the same amount over the same period every 60 seconds. But I have said, and I will always say, I'd rather get the slow trickle of them in at 20-second intervals than wait for all 3 to 60 seconds in. Like, the payout at the end of the day is the same, but the way that you're getting it is much different. Which really brings us to our final section, which is the final takeaways that I have for the Scholar. Really, in summary for the Scholar, what we have here is an extremely consistent healer, more so than any other healer in this game. Between the fairy, the clean DPS contribution rotation, the option to use Ruin 2, the movement speed buff, and the incredibly, extremely available big bulky shields, the Scholar is a healer that I personally do call the most consistent healer in Final Fantasy XIV going into Endwalker. Like, there is a metric ton of power behind its kit, and I think that it's something that a lot of people who don't raid or haven't healed much don't see at first, and it is truly going to be able to do some wild, crazy things leveraging its entire kit from top to bottom. It's going to really smooth out all of the hard, rough edges of progression. Like, literally the movement speed buff Expedient on its own, and 1/3 of the fight's duration having some sort of speed boost, whether it's Expedient or your own sprint, is in and of itself absolutely insane, like utterly insane, and especially with a pre-planned static that knows when Expedient's being used or times it at a particular mechanic. You literally do not have anything in this game that gets quite to the same level as taking the edge off of raid mechanic than that, because it's most of the hard raid mechanics, like say E12S Lions that I know a lot of people hit for walls, or electric cycles for instance in E11S. These are essentially movement-based mechanics. You're getting a way to enhance movement for movement-based mechanics. It doesn't get much more literal than this, guys. It really does not. But, and this is a very huge Nicki Minaj Cardi B sized but, this comes at the extreme cost of the Scholar needing to know their kit. You need to, as the player, know what kind of thing you're piloting. Being able to understand the major trade-offs of a skill like Dissipation, or the fact that they cannot manually control their fairy outside of Fey Union Fairy Tether, or of knowing to let their regens and fairy do work, and the balancing act of regens versus stronger bursts of healing. Not everything needs an indom, guys. Or of knowing the major trade-offs of minor potency improvements through energy drain weaving versus spending that on Aetherflow for a more powerful healing option to give themselves more room, which one's going to be a DPS increase with your particular group. I will always say this, is Aetherflow is a very you to your comfort kind of thing. But one Scholar may do in a group that knows what they're doing and doesn't make mistakes with energy drain spam is probably on the same Scholar going to be radically different if you put them in a group that doesn't know what they're doing. The final message that I have to say to everyone is, when played properly, the Scholar is going to be the absolute monster in the room during Endwalker. It's going to be no different than it has been this entire time. The perks are undeniable and very strong, and I personally can tell you I greatly look forward to keeping Scholar in my toolbox. It is absolutely not going anywhere. I see it being definitely very, very powerful, and people are going to be like, oh, that's Scholar Copium. Have you seen Expedient or done Savage Raids? This is going to be nutty. Just Expedient alone, but the consistency, like, is big.